For long decades, Kirishima Satoshi's bespectacled, long-haired visage has graced wanted posters in police boxes across Japan. The photo shows Kirishima as he was around the period he first became a wanted man, 1975. Back then, he was a member of the Scorpion Cell of the now infamous far-left terrorist organization known as the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front, the Higashiasia Hannichi Buso Sensen. After a series of deadly corporate bombings by the Anti-Japan Front, most of its leadership was arrested. Kirishima Satoshi, however, went to ground. Remarkably, he remained on the lam for an incredible half-century. That is, it seems, until now. Seen today, the man believed to be Kirishima is no longer as youthful as his outdated wanted posters suggest. At 70 years old, the individual in question checked himself into a hospital in Kanagawa Prefecture only a few days ago. He had cancer, believed to be terminal. He was at the hospital using an assumed name, perhaps the one he's lived under all these years. Sources close to the investigation told us here at Unseen Japan that it was a fellow patient who led to the unveiling of Kirishima. When confronted, the suspect admitted that he was, in fact, the person in question. Police are still working to verify that claim. According to someone close to the investigation, police first became aware of Kirishima Satoshi's potential whereabouts on January 25th. Once the police have verified if the patient is indeed Kirishima, his wanted poster will be removed from the Metropolitan Police and National Police Agency websites. The fact that the poster is still up at the websites at present indicates they are not yet fully certain, but now it's only a matter of time. The announcement has set off a media frenzy. Kirishima's face is one amongst many emblazoned unwanted posters that make up a small but memorable subsection of Japan's urban scenery. His is often seen near wanted posters for members of the Japanese Red Army, the Nihon Sekigun, the far-left terrorist group later joined by many of Kirishima's anti-Japan Front compatriots after their organization collapsed. The decades slowly slip by, but the faces mostly stay the same, until sudden, remarkable days like the one that we've just seen. Hello Mina, and welcome back to Unseen Japan. As always, I'm Noah Oskow, and today we're discussing an interesting topic, one that's half breaking news, half modern history. If you've watched my 5-part series on the history of the Japanese Red Army and the New Left, you'll know a bit about those heady times, and what it means for someone wanted by the Japanese police to finally have been found after all these years. If you find this interesting, consider giving that series a watch and subscribing. I have another major history from that era I'd like to tell on this channel. For the time being, let's dive back into the unfolding story of Kirishima Satoshi and the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front. On the morning of August 30th, 1974, the busy Marunouchi business district near Tokyo Station suddenly became a scene of stark carnage. An explosion rocked the neighborhood. Its source? A powerful, homemade time bomb concealed in a flower pot at the entrance to the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries building. The sound of the blast was so loud it could be heard in Shinjuku, on the other side of the city. The glass fronting of the building shattered up to its 11th floor. Nearby cars were destroyed. 5 people in the blast's range died immediately. 3 more died in the hospital soon after. Nearly 400 people were injured. The Wolf Cell of the Anti-Japan Front claimed responsibility. The bombing may have been more devastating than intended. 2 phone calls minutes before the blast attempted to incite evacuations, but both had been ignored. Although with only 10 minutes until the blast was to go off, it is hard to imagine a full evacuation having had effect in any case. Nonetheless, the bombing was claimed as a just act. According to the Anti-Japan Front, it was an attack against the aggressor corporations and the colonialists of Japanese imperialism, like Mitsubishi's bosses. And as for the victims, those people who have, in consequence of the attack by the wolf, been killed or injured are no ordinary workers, or normal non-involved citizens. They are the parasites inside the centers of Japanese imperialism. Now, it should be noted that Kirishima Satoshi was not a member of the Wolf Cell, and nor was he believed to have joined up with the group as of yet. Rather, he belonged to the Scorpion, one of three loosely confederated groups within the anti-Japan front. The wolf was a reference to the cell's leader, Daidoji Masashi, who'd been born in Hokkaido, and held firmly to ideas of returning to a pre-civilization proto-communism. To achieve this within a Japanese context, the modern civilization of Japan would have to be destroyed. The East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front emerged from the dying years of Japan's New Left student movement in the early 1970s. While the 1950s and 60s had seen massive public protests against state violence and the Vietnam War, involving millions of individuals and achieving at times a fairly strong degree of public support, those days were over. The violence of the student movement's fringe, made infamous by the hijackings of the Japanese Red Army and self-directed mass murder by the United Red Army, had turned public sympathies against the New Left. Police moved to break student blockades in universities across the country. Leftist groups were pushed into the streets. Their efforts diminished to localized, if still vigorous, struggles like that against the appropriation of land for Narita Airport. The anti-Japan front's leader, Daidoji, believed in an armed struggle against the state. In his early years in activism, he mostly engaged in the bombing of statues and memorials he saw as representing the oppression of Hokkaido's indigenous Ainu people. His bombing started in 1971. By 1972, his small group was organizing itself into a terrorist underground cell. They operated by existing as outwardly non-radical Japanese citizens. They held jobs and avoided any clothing or personal stylings that would point them out as part of a radical counterculture movement. All the while, they engaged in the study of bomb making during their off hours. To do so, they made use of a guidebook authored by Daidoji called Harahara Toke, the Suspenseful Clock. The book served as both a guide for making explosives and a manual on how to operate as an anti-Japan front member. Its underground success drew new recruits to the organization, which themselves became the Fangs of the Land and the Scorpion Cells. Even other radicals who disapproved of Daidoji's stark anti-Japanism ideology found the book useful. Now, Daidoji's ideology differed rather starkly from that of traditional Marxists. He saw the average Japanese worker not as a proletariat, a potential ally in revolution, but rather as a beneficiary of imperialism and colonialism. The only true proletariats were those in subaltern minority groups not corrupted by the economic gains Japan had seen since the 1950s. Anyone else was essentially an enemy, and fair game for revolutionary-minded attack. Kirishima Satoshi was born in Hiroshima in 1954, just a bit too young to be in university during the height of the New Left movement. He met activists Kurokawa Yoshimasa and Ugajin Hisaishi at Meiji University in 1972. Both were supporters of movements within Tokyo's day labor community in Sanya, aligning with Daidoji's belief in the day labor underclass as being one of the few potential revolutionary groups in Japan. The three of them became the core members of the Scorpion Cell. All three cells, Wolf, Fangs of the Land, and Scorpion, engaged in a series of 11 bombing attacks against Japanese companies. From 1974 to 1975, these attacks injured 32 persons, although no more deaths resulted after the Mitsubishi bombing. The Japanese police have specifically credited Kirishima with detonating a bomb at the Research Institute for South Korean Economy and Industries building in Ginza in April of 1975. Only 1 month later, the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front came to a sudden end. Police monitoring the activities of various other radical groups slowly deduced the web of connections between the three cells. 7 of the group's most important members, including Daidoji, his wife Ayako, and Kurokawa, were arrested. The police, however, were unaware of Kirishima's very existence. By the time they investigated Kirishima's home, using a key Kurokawa had on him as evidence, Kirishima was gone. In his apartment, the police found a makeshift pit, believed to be used for bomb construction. His well-known wanted poster soon went up. Investigators closely monitored all his known associates, but Kirishima stayed away. As the decades passed, police assumed he might have fled abroad. He remained the only East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front member to never be arrested. And now, he never will be. The man believed to be Kirishima passed away on January 29th, only days after police became aware of his assumed secret identity. In his final days, Kirishima let it be known that he wanted people to know who he was. He reportedly stated, "I want to greet my end using my own name." But what had Kirishima been doing all these years avoiding capture with his name plastered all over the landscape of Japan? For half a century, he was not Kirishima Satoshi. Rather, he was Uchida Hiroshi. Those who knew him in daily life referred to him as Uchi. He lived in Fujisawa City, not far from the hospital in Kamakura where he died. From the 1980s, he made a living as a building contractor. Uchida lived at his job site, a building with rusting railings and tape over the windows. All his payments came in the form of cash. Here in Japan, construction has long been one of the few jobs those wishing to remain anonymous could take. Day labor in particular has often been no questions asked, provided a worker demonstrated the necessary skills. The so-called yoseba of Tokyo and Osaka, known as Sanya and Kamagasaki respectively, were for decades a place where those wishing to hide from bad debts, loan sharks, or a past worth forgetting could escape to. Now, Kirishima first joined the anti-Japan armed front via connections with activists who were particularly interested in the revolutionary potential of the day laborers in the various yoseba. So that he would eventually live a similar lifestyle to those in the yoseba is somewhat fitting. Now, living under an assumed name, he would have no government ID. Essentially, he lived as a non-entity as far as the Japanese government was concerned. In his last days, he told investigators, "I was all alone." Neighbors mostly say Uchi was a friendly sort who loved rock music and drinking. One neighbor, however, remembered a night about 10 years ago when Uchida came home drunk, blasting rock music on the radio. He eventually brought out his acoustic guitar and drunkenly began singing to himself. The aggrieved neighbor, unable to get Uchida to answer his doorbell, eventually called the police. They arrived and Uchida quickly quieted. The neighbor said he'd never made that sort of racket again. Uchida discovered he had stomach cancer about 1 year ago. Early this month, he collapsed near a local vending machine. Two neighbors came to his aid, looking after him. Upon entering his apartment, one said Uchida was living in a desperate state. For many who were involved with the bombing cases or who knew Kirishima personally, his sudden reappearance has dredged forth decades-old memories. Former Metropolitan Police Department investigator Tojima Kunio recalled the scene in Ginza following the explosion Kirishima is claimed to have set off. The site looked like a war zone. As time passed, more glass would come falling down, causing a large degree of secondary damage. It was like a scene out of hell. Tojima was involved in the investigation into the bombings. Asked about how a person could evade a half-century-long police dragnet, he responded, "The person goes into hiding by changing their daily clothing. Their lifestyle changes. Even if their facial features remain unchanged, they still appear different. They altered their mannerisms." Tojima added that Kirishima must have had a fairly strong will. As far as the police can tell, he shut himself off completely from friends and family. Yahoo News also interviewed a unnamed former member of the anti-Japan front, who said he was very happy to hear that Kirishima was, at the time, still living. "It's been more than 40 years since we last met. I'm simply dumbfounded. I still can't believe it. I just want to see him, to talk with him. I'm glad he survived." Those who cared for the victims of the bombings expressed a different outlook. The wife of a man badly injured in the Ginza bombing had the following to say. "He hovered between life and death for 2 or 3 days. His whole body was covered in bandages. I can remember it so clearly because of the shock of it all. We know who Kirishima is now because he said so himself, but I still want him to atone for his crimes." As we approach the midway point of the 2020s, the 1960s and 70s sometimes feel incredibly distant. The fact that the wanted poster for Kirishima has remained ubiquitous for so long, just like that of the JRA, often feels more quaint than urgent. And yet, many of the stories of the New Left radicals from that era are only now coming to an end. Daidoji Masashi, leader of the anti-Japan front, died in prison in 2017. Another anti-Japan front member, Ekida Yukiko, who was long on the run with the Japanese Red Army and was eventually arrested in Romania, was released from prison that same year. Shigenobu Fusako, noted leader of the International Japanese Red Army, was just released from prison in 2022. She says she'd still like to play a role in modern politics. The Metropolitan Police say that Kirishima admitted who he was to a hospital worker, saying, "I'm coming to the end. Just arrest me." But even his death isn't really the end. So much of the story of his half-century in hiding awaits. So too do those of former members Daidoji Ayako and Sasaki Norio, who joined the JRA after that organization arranged their release from prison in a hostage exchange in 1977. Their fates still remain unknown. But for now, one wanted poster may finally be disappearing from the landscape of Japan after 5 long decades. Alright everyone, thanks for watching this one. As soon as the story broke, I knew I wanted to cover it for you guys. And also special thanks to Jake Adelstein for providing some background and some additional sources when the story was first breaking. Now, as for whether Uchida is actually Kirishima or not, police say that during discussions with him before his death that he discussed details about the Ginza bombing that only someone involved would likely be able to know. That, of course, points towards him perhaps actually being who he claims to be. Currently, they're working on DNA testing to help verify his identity posthumously. Now, the issue is that Kirishima was never arrested, so they don't have any fingerprints or DNA on hand to compare with 1975 to today. So his surviving family, who haven't seen him since he was 20, are going to be used as DNA samples to compare against to see how likely it is that he's the person he says he is. Or I guess I should say said he was. When it's confirmed, I will leave a comment down below to let you know. Thanks again for watching this episode today. I have a brand new series that I'm working quite hard on, a 2-parter, a bit of interesting cross-cultural history for Japan that I think longtime watchers here will certainly enjoy. So please look forward to that one. I'm going to try to get it done as quickly as possible. These things take a long time, unfortunately, but I've made a lot of progress. If you enjoyed this episode, consider giving us a like, subscribing, or perhaps even giving us some support over on Patreon. We also have a link to the UJ Discord down below, so if you want to have some conversation about this episode or other topics that we cover, please stop on by. So, until next time, mata ne.